In mid-April 1945, a single city stood between victory and the future of the world: Berlin. Smoke drifted over the ruins of what had once been Hitler's capital. Soviet artillery pounded the eastern suburbs. American and British tanks sat less than 100 miles away to the west. Germany was finished. Everyone knew it. But the war was not yet over in the one place that mattered most. Inside Allied headquarters, huge maps covered the walls. Red and blue pins marked the collapse of the Third Reich. Patton's Third Army had ripped through central Germany. Bradley's First Army was advancing behind him. Montgomery's forces were closing in from the north. And to the east, the Red Army was surging forward in a brutal, unstoppable wave. Berlin sat in the middle of it all. To soldiers, it was the last objective. To politicians, it was the future of Europe. Whoever took Berlin would not just end the war, they would write the peace. George Patton understood this. Standing beside the map, he could see how close his armor was. His tanks could reach Berlin in days, not weeks. German units were surrendering without a fight. Roads were open. Bridges were intact. Nothing stood between the Western Allies and the capital of the Reich. Patton didn't see Berlin as a trophy. He saw it as a line in history. Whoever crossed it would decide what came after Hitler. But as Patton pressed forward, another man was slowing everything down: Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was not thinking like a battlefield commander anymore. He was thinking like a coalition leader. He had to keep Britain and the Soviet Union on the same side until Germany surrendered. And in doing so, he was about to make a decision that would shape the world far longer than the war ever could. In Eisenhower's headquarters, reports were stacked high on his desk. Intelligence estimates, casualty projections, political messages from London and Moscow. One thing was clear in every document: the Allies could take Berlin. But Eisenhower was hesitating. Outside, the guns were getting louder. Soviet forces were already fighting their way into the outskirts of the city. Every hour that passed made it more likely that Stalin would reach Berlin first. Patton watched the delay in disbelief. To him, this was madness. The enemy was collapsing. His men were ready. The road was open. And yet, instead of driving forward, Eisenhower was ordering pauses, consolidations, and careful coordination with the Soviets. It was as if the war was being deliberately slowed down. Patton leaned over the map and traced a line with his finger. "Berlin," he said. "That's where this ends." But Eisenhower was staring somewhere else entirely. The war was almost over, but the future was still up for grabs. And Eisenhower was about to give it away. By the first week of April 1945, the war in Western Europe no longer looked like a struggle. It looked like a collapse. German divisions were breaking apart faster than Allied headquarters could even track them. Entire units surrendered without firing a shot. Columns of prisoners moved west along roads that only weeks earlier had been filled with panic. Patton's Third Army was at the center of it all. His armored spearheads pushed forward day and night. Tanks rolled through towns that raised white flags before the first shot was fired. Bridges were captured intact. Supply trucks followed so closely behind the front lines that some units refueled within sight of German surrender ceremonies. It wasn't just fast, it was overwhelming. Patton's method was brutally simple: never let the enemy breathe. Bradley's First Army followed close behind. They moved through central Germany with the same relentless speed. Montgomery's forces pushed down from the north. The Western Allies were converging on the heart of the Reich from 3 directions at once. And in the middle of all those converging arrows on the map sat Berlin. In military terms, the situation was extraordinary. In several sectors, the Western Allies were closer to Berlin than the Red Army. Patton's units had crossed the Zala River. Bradley's troops were racing toward the Elbe. There was no organized German defense left between them and the capital. Patton could feel it. His officers could feel it. Even the soldiers knew something was different. They weren't just advancing. They were breaking through the last barrier. Inside Patton's headquarters, radios crackled with constant updates. Another town taken, another column surrendered, another road cleared. The map changed almost by the hour as blue lines crept closer to Berlin. The speed was intoxicating. But it also created a problem. The faster Patton moved, the harder it became to justify stopping. Every mile gained made Eisenhower's hesitation more visible. Bradley's reports were clear. Resistance was light, casualties were low, German command was collapsing. From a military perspective, Berlin could be taken quickly, and with far fewer losses than the Soviets were likely to suffer. Patton said the same thing. He didn't just want to reach Berlin. He wanted to end the war in a way that left no doubt about who had won. To him, stopping short of the capital was unthinkable. But then the orders from Eisenhower began to change the rhythm. Units were told to pause. Supply movements were adjusted. Boundaries between Allied armies were carefully redrawn. The forward edge of battle, once a blur of motion, began to harden into something deliberate. Patton felt it immediately. Momentum is fragile. It depends on belief as much as fuel. And Patton's greatest weapon had always been the conviction that nothing could stop him. Now, something was. From Eisenhower's headquarters came reminders about coordination with the Soviets, about political boundaries, about agreed lines on a map. To Patton, they sounded like excuses. Berlin was not just another objective, it was the end of the war. And wars, in Patton's mind, should end decisively, not diplomatically. The closer his tanks got, the more frustrated he became. He could almost see the city. And every hour that passed made one thing clearer. If the Western Allies did not move, someone else would. Inside a converted German schoolhouse, Patton's mobile headquarters, the war that had consumed Europe for 6 years was almost over. But to George Patton, something far more dangerous was just beginning. Stacks of intelligence reports covered the tables. They all told the same story. Soviet armies were pushing hard toward Berlin. They were ignoring casualties, grinding forward with relentless force. And everywhere the Red Army went, political officers followed. New governments were being installed. Borders were being reshaped. Eastern Europe was already slipping away. Patton didn't see Stalin as a partner. He saw him as the next enemy. To Patton, Berlin was not about defeating Hitler. Hitler was already beaten. Berlin was about who would control Europe when the dust settled. Whoever occupied that city would dictate the surrender, the occupation, and the balance of power on the continent. Patton had no illusions about what Stalin would do with that power. He had watched the Soviets up close. He had seen how they took territory, how they installed control, how they never gave it back. To him, the Red Army was not liberating Europe. It was conquering it. And Berlin was the crown jewel. Every day, Patton sent messages up the chain of command. He warned that stopping short of Berlin would give Stalin everything he wanted. He argued that the Allies had a responsibility not just to end the war, but to prevent the next one. Some of his staff agreed. Others worried he was going too far. But Patton had seen this before. The First World War had ended in half measures, compromises, and unresolved tensions. He believed wars only truly ended when one side stood unchallenged. Berlin offered that clarity. Patton also understood something else. His soldiers trusted him because he always pushed forward, because speed saved lives, because momentum crushed the enemy before he could recover. Now that momentum was being restrained. Radio messages from Eisenhower's headquarters were polite but firm. Boundaries were being set. Lines of advance adjusted. Berlin was not mentioned. Patton could read between the lines. Eisenhower was choosing politics over victory. To Patton, that was betrayal. Not just of him, but of every man who had fought across France, Belgium, and Germany to reach this moment. The Soviets were racing for Berlin. The Western Allies were slowing down. In Patton's mind, that could only end one way. He stood over the map, watching the red arrows creep closer to the city. If Eisenhower did not act soon, the war would end, and the wrong side would right the peace. In London, Winston Churchill was staring at the same maps as Patton, and he did not like what he saw. The German Reich was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. Allied armies were tearing through Western Germany. Soviet forces were closing in from the east. Berlin was going to fall any day. And whoever took it would shape the world that followed. Churchill understood this better than almost anyone alive. He had spent decades watching empires rise and fall. He knew that military victories meant nothing if they led to political disasters. To him, Berlin was not a battlefield. It was the lever that would decide Europe's future. If Stalin took Berlin, Eastern Europe would be lost. Churchill had no illusions about Soviet intentions. He had worked with Stalin only because Hitler was worse, but he never trusted him. He knew the Red Army did not march simply to defeat Germany. It marched to expand Soviet power. Now that power was approaching the heart of the continent. From the war rooms in London, Churchill sent urgent messages to Eisenhower. He argued that the Western Allies had to push for Berlin. He warned that if the Soviets arrived first, they would never leave. The political cost of restraint, he said, would be far greater than the military cost of an assault. But Churchill did not command the armies on the ground. Eisenhower did. And Eisenhower was not responding the way Churchill hoped. British officers at Allied headquarters echoed the Prime Minister's fears. They could see the Red Army's momentum. They knew Berlin was within reach of Patton's tanks. The opportunity was there, but it was slipping away. Every day of hesitation tilted the balance toward Moscow. Churchill was furious. He had spent the war holding the alliance together, and now that alliance was about to deliver half of Europe into Soviet hands. The irony was bitter. Britain and America had fought to defeat one tyrant, only to empower another. But Eisenhower remained unmoved. To him, the alliance mattered more than any single city. Churchill saw that as a fatal mistake. Berlin was not just a target, it was the hinge of history. And Eisenhower was about to let it swing in the wrong direction. At Supreme Allied Headquarters, Dwight D. Eisenhower sat surrounded by reports, maps, and messages. Outside, the war was being won at astonishing speed. Inside, Eisenhower was fighting a different battle. Germany was already beaten. The question was no longer how to defeat Hitler. It was how to hold together the fragile alliance that had made victory possible. The British were pressing him to race for Berlin. Patton was demanding permission to drive east. Even some of his own staff believed the opportunity was slipping away. But Eisenhower had another fear. Joseph Stalin. Stalin had lost millions of men fighting Hitler. His armies were bearing the heaviest burden of the final assault. Eisenhower knew that if he moved aggressively toward Berlin, Stalin could see it as betrayal. Worse, as an attempt to seize political advantage. At Yalta, rough lines had been drawn on maps. They showed where Allied and Soviet forces would meet. Berlin lay deep inside the Soviet zone. Those lines were meant to prevent accidental clashes, to keep the coalition from tearing itself apart before Germany surrendered. Eisenhower believed crossing them was dangerous. If American or British forces rushed into Berlin, it could provoke a confrontation with the Red Army. With millions of soldiers still under arms, one misunderstanding could ignite a new war before the old one had even ended. To Eisenhower, that risk was unacceptable. He also had to think about casualties. The Soviets were prepared to storm Berlin at horrific cost. Eisenhower was not sure the American public would accept the same sacrifice when the war was already effectively won. Thousands of lives for a city that would, by agreement, be handed over anyway. So Eisenhower hesitated. Every instinct of a battlefield commander told him to press forward. Every calculation of a coalition leader told him to slow down. And in that hesitation, the fate of Berlin was sealed. He chose caution over conquest, stability over speed, agreements over advantage. Patton would never forgive him for it, and Europe would pay the price. At Supreme Allied Headquarters, Dwight D. Eisenhower sat surrounded by reports, maps, and messages. Outside, the war was being won at astonishing speed. Inside, Eisenhower was fighting a different battle. Germany was already beaten. The question was no longer how to defeat Hitler. It was how to hold together the fragile alliance that had made victory possible. The British were pressing him to race for Berlin. Patton was demanding permission to drive east. Even some of his own staff believed the opportunity was slipping away. But Eisenhower had another fear. Joseph Stalin. Stalin had lost millions of men fighting Hitler. His armies were bearing the heaviest burden of the final assault. Eisenhower knew that if he moved aggressively toward Berlin, Stalin could see it as betrayal. Worse, as an attempt to seize political advantage. At Yalta, rough lines had been drawn on maps. They showed where Allied and Soviet forces would meet. Berlin lay deep inside the Soviet zone. Those lines were meant to prevent accidental clashes, to keep the coalition from tearing itself apart before Germany surrendered. Eisenhower believed crossing them was dangerous. If American or British forces rushed into Berlin, it could provoke a confrontation with the Red Army. With millions of soldiers still under arms, one misunderstanding could ignite a new war before the old one had even ended. To Eisenhower, that risk was unacceptable. He also had to think about casualties. The Soviets were prepared to storm Berlin at horrific cost. Eisenhower was not sure the American public would accept the same sacrifice when the war was already effectively won. Thousands of lives for a city that would, by agreement, be handed over anyway. So Eisenhower hesitated. Every instinct of a battlefield commander told him to press forward. Every calculation of a coalition leader told him to slow down. And in that hesitation, the fate of Berlin was sealed. He chose caution over conquest, stability over speed, agreements over advantage. Patton would never forgive him for it, and Europe would pay the price. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin did not celebrate. He calculated. The moment reports arrived that Western Allied forces had halted at the Elbe, Stalin understood exactly what Eisenhower had given him. There would be no race, no negotiation, no Western armies complicating his plans. The capital of Nazi Germany was now his to take. Stalin summoned his senior commanders and made his expectations brutally clear. Berlin had to fall quickly. It had to fall decisively. And it had to fall before anyone in the West had time to reconsider. The Red Army was already bleeding heavily. Soviet soldiers had fought their way across Poland and into Germany through some of the most savage combat of the war. Casualties were staggering. But Stalin was not interested in slowing down. For him, Berlin was not a city. It was a political prize. Whoever raised their flag over the Reichstag would control the story of the war. They would shape the occupation, the borders, and the future governments of Europe. Stalin was determined that it would be a Soviet flag flying over the ruins. Orders went out to push forward at any cost. Divisions were thrown into the fight in waves. Artillery hammered German defenses into rubble. Tanks rolled through streets already reduced to ash. There was no pause, no consolidation, no concern for the men being sent into the fire. The Western Allies stood still, while the Red Army bled its way into history. On the ground, Soviet soldiers fought with the desperation of men who knew the world was watching. They stormed buildings. They crossed open squares under machine gun fire. They fought in sewers, in basements, in shattered stairwells. Berlin became a slaughterhouse. Yet to Stalin, the cost was acceptable. Every life spent bought him more than the military victory. It bought him leverage. From the West, Allied commanders listened to the reports in silence. They knew what was happening. They knew that if they had moved, the battle for Berlin might have been shorter and far less destructive. But the halt order remained. The opportunity Eisenhower had surrendered was now being paid for in blood. And when the fighting finally ended, there would be no doubt about who owned the city. Berlin would belong to Stalin. By the last days of April, Berlin was no longer a city. It was a ruin. Soviet artillery had turned entire neighborhoods into fields of shattered stone. Smoke filled the air so thick that even midday looked like dusk. Fires burned unchecked. Streets that had once carried trams and crowds were now choked with debris, overturned vehicles, and bodies. The Red Army came in from every direction. Infantry advanced behind creeping barrages. Tanks crawled through narrow streets, firing at windows and doorways. Every building became a fortress. Every basement became a killing ground. German resistance was fierce but hopeless. The defenders knew the war was lost, but they fought anyway. Driven by fear of what the Soviets would do when they arrived, boys and old men manned machine guns. SS units fought to the last bullet. Hitler's orders to hold Berlin at all costs had turned the city into a death trap. Civilians were trapped in the middle. Families hid in cellars while shells crashed through their homes. Hospitals overflowed. Food ran out. Berliners who had survived years of bombing now faced a battle that would finish the job. And all the while, just beyond the Elbe, American and British soldiers waited. They could hear the guns. They could see the glow of fires on the horizon. They knew history was being written a few dozen miles away, and they were not part of it. The Soviet assault was relentless. One by one, Berlin's defenses collapsed. Outer districts fell, then the inner ring. Finally, Soviet troops reached the government quarter. Fighting their way toward the Reichstag, the cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers died. German casualties were just as horrific. Civilians paid an uncounted price. Yet when the red flag finally rose, none of that mattered to Stalin. The world would see that the Red Army had taken Berlin. The war in Europe was over, but the consequences were only beginning. When the guns finally fell silent, Berlin lay in ruins, and it lay in Soviet hands. Western Allied troops did not march into the city as liberators. They arrived later as guests. The Red Army controlled the streets, the government buildings, and the story of victory. Stalin had what he wanted. Germany was quickly divided into zones of occupation. What had been drawn on maps at Yalta became hard reality on the ground. The Soviet zone swallowed the East, the Western Allies held the West. And Berlin, sitting deep inside Soviet territory, was split like a wound. Almost immediately, the difference became clear. In the East, communist governments were installed. Opponents disappeared. Industries were seized. Eastern Europe was being reshaped in the image of Moscow. In the West, democratic governments were rebuilt. Economies were restored. Two very different futures emerged. The line that separated them ran straight through Berlin. George Patton watched all of this with bitter recognition. This was exactly what he had warned about. The Soviets were not leaving. They were turning military victory into permanent control. But Patton's outspokenness soon became inconvenient. His criticism of Soviet intentions made him a liability. He was sidelined, then quietly removed from command. Eisenhower, meanwhile, became a hero. The war was won, the alliance had held. Few people asked what had been lost. But on the streets of Berlin, the truth was impossible to ignore. The city was no longer just a capital. It was a fault line, and the world was beginning to crack along it. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, but the world that followed was shaped by what happened in Berlin. What Eisenhower did in those final weeks was not written in any treaty. It was not debated in any parliament. It was simply the result of one choice: to stop when he could have advanced, to honor agreements when he could have seized advantage, to trust a partner who had his own plans. By allowing Stalin to take Berlin, Eisenhower locked in the map of post-war Europe. The consequences came quickly. Germany was divided for decades. Eastern Europe fell behind an iron curtain. Millions lived under regimes they never chose. Berlin became the most dangerous city on earth, a place where two nuclear empires stared at each other across a wall. Every Cold War crisis, every blockade, every standoff traced its roots to April 1945. To the moment the Western Allies stood still and the Red Army marched forward. George Patton did not live to see how far it would go. He died later that year, still convinced the Soviets were the real threat. His warnings, once dismissed, now read like prophecy. Eisenhower became president. He spent his life managing the very tension his decision had helped create. He believed he had chosen the lesser evil. History has never fully agreed. Some say he saved lives and preserved peace. Others say he handed half of Europe to a dictator. Berlin became the symbol of that argument, a city destroyed by war, then frozen by fear. And it all began with a single order: the decision to stop, the decision to wait, the decision to let Stalin take Berlin. Whether it was wisdom or weakness depends on where you stand. But one thing is certain: that moment did not just end a war, it divided the world.